The Once and Future Present, Episode 5, A World in Crisis, Late Medieval Europe Before the Black Death, an AP European History podcast from Hammer History Productions. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Once and Future Present, the AP European History podcast from Hammer History Productions. In today's episode, we're reviewing Chapter 11 from A History of Western Society by McKay. A look at the institutions, ideas, and pressures that defined Europe before the 14th century crisis. I'm Casey, and today we're stepping into the medieval world. A world full of castles and cathedrals, kings and peasants, and a church that touched every corner of life. But before we talk about plague and rebellion, we need to understand what came before. What kind of Europe was about to be transformed by crisis?
That's right, Casey. To understand the 14th century crisis, the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and growing unrest, we have to go back and look at the structures and institutions that had defined Europe for centuries. Let's start at the foundation, the legacy of the Roman Empire.
The Roman Empire dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries. Its fall in the West in 476 CE didn't mean everything Roman disappeared. In fact, Roman law, language, architecture, and infrastructure had lasting impacts. Latin remained the language of the church and scholarship. Roman roads and cities continued to shape the geography of Europe. But with the empire gone, who would bring order? Even after the western part of the empire fell, the eastern portion, known as the Byzantine Empire, continued for nearly 1,000 years, with its capital at Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. The Byzantines preserved Roman laws and culture, developed Orthodox Christianity, and served as a buffer between Western Europe and various Islamic empires. Their legacy would influence both Eastern and Western traditions, especially as their decline opened the door to the rise of the Ottoman Empire.
That's where Christianity steps in, right?
Exactly. As the Roman state declined, the Christian church rose to fill the power vacuum. By the late Roman Empire, Christianity had become the state religion. In 313 CE, the Roman Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity. Later, Emperor Theodosius Thirst made it the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380 CE. This transformed Christianity from a persecuted minority into a state-backed institution. The bishops of major cities gained political authority, and church councils began defining doctrine, all supported by imperial power. When the Western Empire fell, the Catholic Church became the most stable institution in Europe. It wasn't just a spiritual guide, it became a political, economic, and cultural powerhouse.
The church provided education through monastic schools. It administered charity, owned vast lands, and collected tithes. The Pope, as the head of the church, could challenge kings and emperors. Think of the church as the one truly international institution in medieval Europe. It offered a common identity, Christendom. And here's something that might surprise you. The Pope wasn't a hereditary monarch. He was elected by a group of cardinals in a somewhat democratic process. This gave the Church an air of legitimacy that came from collective choice rather than just family lineage.
So was the Pope basically like a medieval president of Europe?
Not quite a president, more like a spiritual emperor. And yes, in some cases, popes did exert more influence than kings, especially when kings were weak or divided. But it was complicated. The church and state often cooperated, but they also clashed over power and authority.
For example, disputes over lay investiture, who had the right to appoint bishops, caused major political conflicts, especially in the Holy Roman Empire. Lay investiture mattered because bishops weren't just spiritual leaders, they were also powerful landowners. If a king could choose who became bishop, he gained political allies and influence. The church wanted to reserve that power for itself, to prevent secular rulers from manipulating church leadership. This was about more than appointments. It was a battle over whether kings or popes held ultimate authority in Christian Europe. So even when the church was respected, it was also resented at times.
Wait, can we pause for a second? I've been hearing a lot in class about sovereignty, authority, and legitimacy. Can we talk about how those ideas connect to the church and medieval kings like Charlemagne?
That's a great question, Casey. Sovereignty means who has the ultimate power to rule and independent from outside interference. Authority is about who people recognize as having that power. And legitimacy is why they believe that authority is justified, why people are willing to accept the decisions of the government and follow the laws.
That sets the stage for the relationship between Charlemagne and the Catholic Church, right?
The church had moral and spiritual authority. It claimed to speak for God. Kings, meanwhile, had military and political control. But their rule wasn't always seen as legitimate unless it was blessed by the church. That's why Pope Leo III, crowning Charlemagne, was such a powerful symbol. It showed church and state working together to reinforce each other's legitimacy. Charlemagne is a key figure. He ruled from 768 to 814 CE and was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in 800. This was a symbolic moment, a pope crowning a new Roman-style emperor. It signaled a revival of the imperial idea in the West.
Charlemagne expanded his realm across much of Western Europe. He promoted Christianity, supported education, and brought scholars to his court. This revival of learning and culture is often called the Carolingian Renaissance.
So was he trying to bring back Rome?
In a sense, yes. But his empire didn't last long after his death. His grandsons divided it, and over time it fractured. Still, the idea of a Holy Roman Empire persisted in Europe for centuries.
In the absence of a strong central authority, a new political and social structure took hold. Feudalism. Land was the main source of wealth, and power was based on loyalty and military service. This system was deeply hierarchical, and many people understood it through the lens of the great chain of being, a religious and philosophical concept that ranked everything in creation in a fixed order. God was at the top, followed by angels, kings, nobles, commoners, animals, and even plants and rocks. In society, this meant everyone had a divinely ordained place, and stepping out of that role was seen as disruptive or sinful.
I remember the pyramid. Kings, nobles, knights, and peasants.
Exactly. At the bottom were the serfs, peasants legally tied to the land. They owed labor and dues to their lords. In exchange, they received protection and the right to work a portion of the land for themselves. They had families, some legal rights, and a place in the feudal structure, but they couldn't leave the manor without permission.
Wait, what's the difference between a serf and a slave? It sounds kind of the same.
Good question. Slaves are considered property and can be sold or moved at will. Serfs, on the other hand, were not owned as people. They were bound to a specific piece of land, so if the land changed hands, they went with it. It was still an unfree condition, but it was a step above slavery in terms of rights and recognition. In exchange, they received protection. It was a system built on obligation, not opportunity. The economic foundation of this system was the manor, a self-sufficient farming estate. Trade had declined, so people relied on local goods and services.
Did women have roles in this system?
Absolutely, though they varied by class. Noble women could act as regents or manage estates. Peasant women worked in the fields, tended animals, and managed households. Their labor was essential, but their legal rights were very limited.
Was everyone just stuck in place?
For the most part, yes. Social mobility was rare, but by the 11th and 12th centuries, things began to change.
Towns began to grow. Long-distance trade revived, thanks in part to crusades and contacts with the Islamic world. Merchants and artisans formed guilds, and new urban classes emerged.
Also, Der Morgan, what exactly was a guild? We've talked about them in class, but I'm still not totally clear.
Great question. A guild was like a professional association or trade union for artisans and merchants. There were guilds for blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, you name it. Guilds controlled the quality of goods, set prices, trained apprentices, and protected members' interests. They helped regulate economic life in growing towns and ensured that skilled workers had a stable place in society.
Exactly. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Ghent became commercial hubs. Markets and fairs brought people together, and cash became more common than barter.
With urban growth came new intellectual life. Universities were founded in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These schools trained clergy, lawyers, and doctors. Students studied the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and then theology, law, or medicine.
The dominant intellectual style was scholasticism, which aimed to reconcile Christian faith with classical reason. Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar, was one of the leading thinkers. He argued that reason and faith could work together to understand God's creation.
So people were starting to think critically, even in a religious society?
Yes, but within limits. Most scholars still worked within a religious framework, but it laid the groundwork for later developments like humanism and the Renaissance. Their goal was to develop their critical thinking to better understand the God's will and the Bible.
Now let's talk about signs of strain. Europe's population had grown steadily since the year 1000, but by the early 1300s, that growth began to outpace agricultural productivity.
That led to the Great Famine of 1315-1317, a period of terrible weather, crop failures, and starvation. Millions died. It showed just how vulnerable society was to environmental stress.
Were people blaming the government or the church?
In some cases, yes. There was growing discontent with the church's wealth and its involvement in politics. Critics accused bishops and abbots of being more concerned with power than with piety.
This dissatisfaction would grow in the decades to come, especially during the Avignon Papacy and the Great Schism, but we'll get to those in the next episode.
So Europe was already in trouble before the plague?
Yes, structurally, socially, and spiritually. And then came the crisis. But that is another topic for the next episode.
But while Europe was showing signs of stress, a new power was rising just beyond its borders, the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottomans emerged in the late 13th century in Anatolia, as Turkish leaders built a new Islamic state out of the remnants of the Seljuk Turks. Under leaders like Osman and Orhan, they began expanding into Byzantine territory.
By the early 1300s, they were becoming a serious threat to Christian Europe. And in 1453, spoiler alert, they would capture Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire and becoming a dominant force in European, Asian, and African politics.
So even while Europe was faltering, the Ottomans were rising?
Exactly. Their story runs parallel to European history, and we'll see them again and again in later episodes, especially when we get to the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration.
All right. So we've got a powerful church, a rigid social hierarchy, new towns and universities, and an emerging empire at Europe's doorstep. And it's all about to be shaken by famine, disease, and war.
That's right. The world we've described was relatively stable, but also fragile, and the 14th century would expose those vulnerabilities.
Next time, we'll dive into the Black Death and the full crisis of the 14th century. Thanks for listening to The Once and Future Present. Don't forget to check out our music projects on YouTube and Spotify by searching Hammer History Productions. And as always, stay curious and think critically.